He didn't flinch. Clear's throat, he didn't drop the phone. He didn't even look away from the monitor. In a world of ruthless boardrooms where a single weak moment could result in a corporate bloodbath, Do-Hyuk did the one thing nobody expected. He stood in absolute silence. It was a stillness so cold, a mask of such perfect authority, that 99% of the world would have thought he felt nothing. But Nicole Williams wasn't part of that 99%. She was a nurse in a hospital ward where power meant nothing, and she saw through it. That single moment of silence didn't just reveal a son's regret. It ignited a corporate war, unburied a 20-year-old secret, and turned a mysterious nurse into the most dangerous threat to his empire. This is the story of how a secret phone call changed everything. The antiseptic in this hospital didn't wash things clean. It just masked the scent of a dying legacy. It was 1:14 a.m. in Seoul, and the VIP wing, a place where money usually bought more time, felt eerily empty. Lydia Do-Hyuk lay under silk sheets that cost more than most people's homes, her silver hair fanned against the pillow like a fading halo. She was a woman of quiet dignity, but the machines beside her hummed a rhythm that even her son's billions couldn't change. Near the window stood Do-Hyuk, immaculate in a charcoal suit that reflected the glow of the city he supposedly owned. His jaw was a hard line of permanent authority, the face of a man who made rivals disappear with a whisper. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for a way to press call on a phone that had felt like lead in his hand for years. The door opened with a soft, sterile click. It wasn't a doctor with bad news, and it certainly wasn't one of his terrified assistants. It was Nicole. The name was unknown in the elite circles of Seoul, but in this room she occupied the space with a calm that bordered on defiance. She was tall, her blue scrubs stark against her dark skin, a stethoscope resting against shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of every secret in the ward. She didn't bow. She didn't tremble. She simply held out a phone, not his but hers, with a screen that glowed with a single accusing word: boss. The silence in the VIP wing was heavier than the city's smog, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Do-Hyuk stood paralyzed, his reflection in the dark window staring back with eyes that had crushed competitors but couldn't meet his mother's gaze. He was the boss of Seoul, a man whose charcoal suit served as a suit of armor against a world of corporate vultures. Yet in this room he was merely a ghost in a designer frame. Behind him, Nicole Williams waited with the patience of someone who dealt in the currency of life and death every day. Her phone was still extended, the word boss blinking like a beacon of his own failure. How long? Do-Hyuk's voice finally broke the quiet, low and dangerous, though the threat was aimed more at the reality he had ignored than at the woman behind him. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Long enough to know that she's been waiting for you to be more than a headline, Nicole replied, her voice a calm contrast to the frantic beeping of the heart monitor. She stepped past him, her blue scrubs rustling, a sound that seemed louder than the politician's promises he heard daily. She reached the bedside of Lydia Do-Hyuk, the dying queen of a fallen dynasty. Lydia's silver hair was fanned out across the pillow, a pale halo for a woman who had once been the only person Do-Hyuk feared disappointing. Do-Hyuk finally turned, his jaw tight, his brows carved into a mask of permanent authority. He looked at the four dripping quietly, at the oxygen cannula resting beneath his mother's fragile nostrils, and then at the phone in Nicole's hand. You've been arranging these calls through your personal device, he said, his tone shifting back to the steel of a CEO. Why involve yourself in the affairs of a stranger? Nicole didn't flinch. Her dark eyes, observant and unsettlingly composed, locked onto his. In this ward, no one is a stranger when they're gasping for air, Mr. Nam, she said. And she didn't want her son's last memory of her to be a dial tone. She brought the phone closer to Lydia's ear, the connection still active. Say something, she whispered. Do-Hyuk swallowed hard, the steel in his throat turning to lead. He looked at his mother, her tired eyelids fluttering, listening for a voice that hadn't come in years. For decades he had buried himself in hostile takeovers and empire building, convincing himself he did it all for her. But in the pursuit of success he had forgotten the person he was succeeding for. He leaned over the bed, the expensive fabric of his suit crinkling. For the first time in 20 years the boss was gone. Yama, he whispered. Lydia's fingers twitched against the silk sheets, and a single faint tear slipped from the corner of her eye. Nicole watched him with a quiet knowing, aware that the secrets of 20 years ago were finally beginning to surface as the clock ran out. The heavy silence of the VIP wing returned as the heart monitor settled into its rhythmic mechanical chirp, a sound that underscored the fragility of the moment. Do-Hyuk pulled back, his hands still hovering near his mother's frail fingers, his eyes darting toward Nicole Williams. He expected to see the usual reaction of those who witnessed his rare moments of vulnerability: fear, pity, or the calculating gaze of someone looking for a weakness to exploit. Instead, he found Nicole adjusting the foredrip with a steady hand, her expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. "You have a lot of questions for a man who usually has all the answers," Nicole said without looking up, her voice slicing through his rising defenses. She moved to the foot of the bed, her dark eyes eventually meeting his with a directness that felt like a physical challenge. "But right now, the only thing that matters is that she heard you." Do-Hyuk straightened his charcoal suit, the fabric crisp and cold against his skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the tear he had just seen on his mother's face. "I don't like mysteries, Nurse Williams. Especially not ones that involve my family and my private affairs." He stepped toward her, his jaw set in the line of permanent authority that usually made subordinates retreat. "You said she tells me she forgives me. My mother hasn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. How could you possibly know the contents of her heart?" Nicole didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her stethoscope resting against shoulders that seemed entirely unimpressed by his corporate stature. "Regret has a specific frequency, Mr. Nam. I've spent enough time in this room to hear it even when she's sleeping." She tucked her phone into her scrub pocket and stepped closer, invading the personal space he guarded so fiercely. "You think power can bargain with death, that you can buy back the years you spent building that empire. But Lydia isn't impressed by your stock prices. She's been trying to tell you something about why your father really disappeared 20 years ago." The mention of his father sent a jolt of ice through Do-Hyuk's veins, a corporate betrayal he had buried under layers of hostile takeovers. "You're overstepping," he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I'm the only one in this city who isn't afraid to tell you the truth," Nicole replied softly, her gaze holding a shadow of knowledge that suggested she wasn't just a witness to his mother's end, but a key to his own beginning. She walked toward the door, the lock clicking softly as she prepared to leave him with his thoughts and the dying queen. "Secrets always surface when time runs out, Do-Hyuk. I'm just here to make sure you're listening when they do." The door closed with a muted thud, leaving Do-Hyuk alone in the dim amber glow of the emergency lights. He stared at his mother, Lydia, whose chest rose and fell in a shallow mechanical rhythm that seemed to mock his own frantic heartbeat. The steel he had spent a lifetime forging around his soul was beginning to warp under the heat of Nicole's accusations. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold glass of his own phone, a device filled with the numbers of world leaders and industry giants, yet useless in the one conversation that mattered. He looked back at the door where the mysterious nurse had disappeared. Nicole Williams was a ghost in blue scrubs, a stranger who claimed to have bridged the gap he had spent 20 years widening. "She calls you every night," Nicole had said. The words played on a loop in his mind, hitting harder than any hostile takeover or corporate betrayal. He moved to the nightstand, his eyes searching the sterile surface until they landed on a small, worn notebook he hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath a stack of medical charts. As he opened it, a slip of paper fell out, a call log written in Nicole's precise, steady hand. Every entry was timed at 11:42 p.m., a ritual performed while he was usually miles away, signing away lives or expanding his borders. He realized then that while power ruled his world outside, Nicole had been building a sanctuary of sound inside this room. She hadn't just been arranging calls. She had been acting as a lifeline for a woman who refused to let her son's last memory of her be silence. Do-Hyuk leaned over his mother, the scent of antiseptic and fading jasmine clinging to her skin. He thought of his empire building, the strategic marriages and the power moves he had told himself were all for her. But as he looked at her frail form, he saw the truth Nicole already knew. You cannot bargain with death and you cannot buy back time. He took Lydia's hand, his thumb tracing the thin skin of her wrist, and for the first time he felt the crushing weight of his success. "Yama," he whispered again, the word catching in his throat. He wasn't just the boss of Seoul anymore. He was a man standing on the edge of a truth that had been buried for 2 decades. Nicole hadn't just stepped into the gap. She had opened a door to a secret from 20 years ago that was finally ready to be answered. The machines kept beeping, marking the steady retreat of his mother's life, and Do-Hyuk realized that the most dangerous target in the city wasn't a rival. It was the truth Nicole held in her steady, dark eyes. The small notebook felt like a live wire in Do-Hyuk's hand, pulsing with the silent frequency of his mother's final days. He turned the page, finding a series of handwritten transcriptions. Not medical stats but words. Nicole had documented the one-sided conversations Lydia held with the heir when she thought no one was listening. It was a secret language of forgiveness, written in the margins of a life that power had tried to erase. The door creaked and Nicole stepped back into the room, her presence as quiet and unsettlingly composed as a shadow. She didn't ask why he was holding the notebook, she already knew. She wasn't just talking to herself, Mr. Nam, Nicole said softly, her dark eyes reflecting the soft green pulses of the heart monitor. She was practicing for the moment you finally showed up. She knew your pride wouldn't let you hear her if she sounded weak. Do-Hyuk looked down at a specific entry dated 2 weeks prior. Tell him the ledger isn't a weapon, it read. It's a shield. Tell him his father didn't leave because of greed. He left to keep the shadows away from the door. The words cracked the armor around Do-Hyuk's heart. For 20 years he had operated under the assumption that his father was a coward who had abandoned them for a better life. He had used that bitterness to fuel his hostile takeovers and his cold, strategic marriages. You knew what this was, Do-Hyuk rasped, his voice losing its steel as he looked at Nicole. You're not just a nurse. You're the keeper of a secret that was never buried properly. Nicole stepped closer to the bed, her hand resting gently on Lydia's silver hair. I'm a woman who understands that secrets are like infections, Do-Hyuk. If you don't drain them, they kill the host. She looked at him with a quiet knowing that made him feel more exposed than any rival's investigation ever could. Your mother didn't want her son's last memory of her to be silence, because silence is where the lies live. A faint sound came from the bed, a sharp intake of breath. Lydia's eyes fluttered open, searching the room until they landed on Do-Hyuk. She couldn't speak, the oxygen cannula and the foredrip marking the limits of her strength, but she reached out her hand. Do-Hyuk took it, his grip tightening as he realized that power could not bargain with death, but it could finally answer the truth. In his mother's gaze he saw not judgment, but the same quiet knowing Nicole possessed. The secret from 20 years ago was no longer a shadow. It was a ghost in the room, waiting for him to finally say its name. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator felt like a countdown as Do-Hyuk watched his mother drift back into a fragile sleep. He stepped away from the bed, his mind churning with the revelation of the ledger and the father he had spent 2 decades hating. He found Nicole in the dimly lit hallway, standing by a window that looked out over the sprawling neon grid of Seoul. She wasn't supposed to be memorable, just another blue uniform in a sea of sterile white. But as she turned to face him, the moonlight caught the sharp, intelligent line of her profile. Who are you really, Nicole? Do-Hyuk asked, his voice returning to the low, dangerous rumble that had silenced boardrooms. He invaded her personal space, looming over her with the weight of a man who owned the very ground she stood on. Nurses in this wing don't talk about 20-year-old corporate secrets. They don't know about the shadows at the door. And they certainly don't have eyes that look like they've seen the inside of a courtroom. Nicole didn't flinch, her stethoscope resting against steady shoulders as she met his icy gaze. I told you I'm just a woman who doesn't believe in silence. She adjusted her scrubs, her movements calm and observant. But if you're asking why a black nurse from the States is working in a private VIP wing in Korea, maybe you should look at the names of the families your father betrayed to build your foundation. Do-Hyuk froze. The air between them crackled with a sudden, sharp electricity. For years he had buried his family's rise under the sanitizing language of strategic marriages and hostile takeovers, but Nicole was peeling back the layers of grime he thought had been washed clean. My father's name was David Williams, she said softly, her voice possessing a crystalline clarity that cut through his authority. He was a lead consultant for your father. When the Johnny Falconet of Seoul disappeared, my father didn't just lose his job. He was the fall guy. He was the one who went to prison for the crimes your mother is now trying to forgive. Do-Hyuk felt the floor of his empire shift. He had seen Nicole as a mercy, a stranger who had stepped into the gap of his own neglect. But as she stood there, unsettlingly composed and holding the shadow of a knowledge she hadn't fully spoken. He realized she wasn't a stranger at all. He was the reckoning. You didn't come here to help her, Do-Hyuk rasped, his grip tightening around the notebook. I came here to see if the son was worth the mother's mercy, Nicole replied, her dark eyes studying him with a quiet knowing. The question now isn't if you'll answer the phone, Do-Hyuk. It's whether you're ready to answer for the truth. The neon pulse of Seoul's skyline bled through the hospital glass, a reminders of the empire Do-Hyuk had built on a foundation he now realized was made of glass and bone. He stood in the center of the sterile room, the small notebook clutched in his hand like a live grenade. Across the bed, Nicole Williams watched him, her calm defiance a mirror to the chaos currently dismantling his internal world. Between them lay Lydia, the silent center of a storm 20 years in the making, her breathing rhythmic and shallow, the only sound in a room where a legacy was being judged. You think this changes who I am? Do-Hyuk's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, the sound of a man trying to talk himself back into his armor. My father's disappearance was a business reality. My rise was a necessity. If your father was the fall guy, that was the cost of doing business in a city that eats the weak. Is that what you'll tell her when she wakes up for the last time? Nicole asked, her voice possessing a crystalline clarity that made his corporate logic sound like a hollow excuse. She stepped closer to the monitor, her eyes reflecting the soft green pulses. She's been trying to save you from becoming the very thing that destroyed your father. She isn't asking for your success, Do-Hyuk. She's asking for your soul. Do-Hyuk looked at the notebook, at the handwritten transcriptions of his mother's secret language of forgiveness. He knew that with a single word to his security team he could have Nicole removed, her records erased, and the Williams family's history buried once and for all. It was the strategic move. The power move. It was exactly what the boss of Seoul was forged to do. But then he looked at Lydia. Her fingers twitched against the silk sheets, a faint promise that she was still listening for the son she had once known. He realized that for decades he had replaced every memory of her with a hostile takeover, every Iyama with a contract. If he destroyed Nicole's evidence now, he would finally win the war for his empire, but he would lose the queen who had stayed alive just to see him surrender. The machines kept beeping, marking the steady retreat of the only person who had ever loved the man beneath the charcoal suit. Nicole watched him, not with judgment but with that quiet, unsettling knowing. The silence is where the lies live, Do-Hyuk, she whispered, echoing the notebook's warning. Are you ready to be the king of a graveyard, or a son who finally comes home? Do-Hyuk's grip on the notebook loosened. For the first time he didn't look like a titan. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a truth he could no longer afford to bury. The antiseptic scent of the hallway felt sharper, more clinical, as Do-Hyuk stepped away from his mother's bedside to meet the ghost he had spent a lifetime running from. Nicole stood by the small nurse's station, her silhouette framed by the flickering fluorescent light that gave the ward the feeling of a purgatory where secrets came to die. She held a manila folder, the edges yellowed with the kind of age that only exists in forgotten archives and cold cases. It was the physical manifestation of the shadow that had haunted his family for 20 years, a record that had never been buried properly. You think your father just vanished into thin air because he couldn't handle the pressure, Nicole said, her voice a low, steady chime in the quiet of the night shift. She opened the folder, revealing a grainy black and white photograph of two men standing in front of the very building Do-Hyuk now called his headquarters. One was his father, Johnny, looking younger and less haunted. The other was David Williams, Nicole's father. They weren't just business partners. They looked like brothers in arms, oblivious to the corporate betrayal that was about to dismantle their lives. Do-Hyuk reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the image. For years his empire building had been a way to overwrite this history, to prove that he was stronger than the man who had supposedly run away to protect him. But as he looked at the date on the back of the photo, the night of the final takeover, he realized that Johnny Falcone he had hated was a fiction created by the syndicate of rivals who had actually orchestrated the fall. Your mother didn't just keep your father's calls a secret, Do-Hyuk, Nicole whispered, her dark eyes studying him with that unsettlingly composed knowing. She kept the evidence of the hit that was put on him. He didn't run because he was a coward. He ran because he was the only witness to the bribe that built your throne. The revelation hit harder than any corporate blow. The steel in Do-Hyuk's voice was gone, replaced by the hollow realization that his success was a debt he could never repay. He looked toward his mother's room where Lydia lay dying, the keeper of a 20-year-old truth that was finally screaming through the silence. Nicole wasn't just a stranger who had stepped into the gap. She was the ghost's messenger, reminding him that power could not bargain with death, and blood always remembers its origins. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed with a clinical indifference that made the manila folder in Do-Hyuk's hands feel impossibly heavy. He retreated into the shadows of a nearby consultation room, the steel of his public persona cracking as he finally opened the contents of Nicole's hidden file. Inside, it wasn't just corporate jargon. It was a digital trail of breadcrumbs left by David Williams before the Johnny Falcone of Seoul was forced to vanish. There were copies of encrypted ledgers and bank transfers that didn't just suggest corruption, they mapped it out with devastating precision. Do-Hyuk's eyes scanned the names of the recipients, recognizing the very men who currently sat on his board of directors, the vultures he had called allies in his climb to the top. For 20 years, these men had whispered in his ear that his father was a traitor, while they were the ones who had siphoned the lifeblood out of the company and framed the two men who tried to stop them. My father didn't just go to prison for the money. Nicole's voice came from the doorway, her presence as calm and observant as ever. She stepped into the room, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh light of the documents. He went to prison to keep me safe. Because the people you work with, the ones you call partners, are the same ones who ordered the hit on your father 20 years ago. Do-Hyuk felt a surge of rage, not just at the betrayal, but at the realization that his entire empire was a gilded cage built by his enemies. He looked at a specific document, a final and signed memo from his father to David Williams, warning him that the syndicate was moving in. You've had this all along, Do-Hyuk rasped, his jaw tight as he looked at Nicole. You've been watching me build a throne on top of your family's ruin. I was watching to see if you would become them, Nicole replied, her voice possessing a crystalline clarity that stripped away his excuses. I brought the file because Lydia is out of time. She didn't want you to just be successful, Do-Hyuk. She wanted you to be the one to finish what your father started. The machines in the distance continued their rhythmic chirping, a reminder that the dying queen was fading while the boss was finally waking up to the truth. Nicole wasn't just a nurse or a stranger. She was the holder of the missing pieces of his own identity. As Do-Hyuk clutched the hidden file, he realized that the corporate war wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time he wasn't fighting for profit, but for the legacy of the ghosts who had been waiting 20 years for justice. The 11:42 p.m. ritual was broken by a sound that wasn't a mechanical beep or a shifting ventilator. It was a rasp, a dry intake of breath that carried the weight of 20 years of silence. Lydia's eyes, usually clouded by the fog of morphine and time, snapped open with a clarity that made Nam Do-Hyuk's heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He dropped the hidden file onto the bedside table, the names of his traitorous directors staring up at him, as he leaned into his mother's fragile orbit. "Yama," he whispered, his voice cracking beneath the charcoal suit that could no longer protect him from the truth. Lydia didn't look at the machines or the luxury of the VIP wing. Her gaze drifted past her son to Nicole Williams, who stood at the foot of the bed like a silent sentinel. A microsecond of recognition passed between the dying queen and the mysterious nurse, a quiet knowing that the debt was finally being called in. Nicole stepped forward, not with a needle but with the steady presence of a witness. She gently lifted the oxygen cannula, granting Lydia a final, desperate moment of speech. "The calls." Lydia wheezed, her fingers twitching toward the phone Nicole had used to bridge the gap of his neglect. "They weren't for me, Do-Hyuk. They were for you." Do-Hyuk felt the floor shift. For years he had convinced himself that his mother was a victim of his father's cowardice, a woman who needed the protection of his corporate empire. But Lydia's confession, delivered in the hollowed-out silence of midnight, revealed a different reality. She had been the one to send Johnny away. She had orchestrated the disappearance, to keep the syndicate's eyes on her and away from the small son she had hidden in the suburbs of a life she hated. "I lied," she whispered, a faint tear slipping from her eye to the silk pillow. "Your father. He didn't run. He stayed at the door until the shadows took him. I made them believe he was a rat so they wouldn't look for the ledger. I kept it in the one place they'd never look." She reached out, her grip surprisingly firm as she pulled Do-Hyuk closer. "Nicole knows where it is. Her father died for that book and now you must live for it. Do-Hyuk looked at Nicole, whose dark eyes were unforgiving yet expectant. The waitress of his soul was dead. The son of Johnny Falconet was waking up. As Lydia's hand went limp, the confession hanging in the air like smoke, Do-Hyuk realized he wasn't just ready to answer the phone. He was ready to burn the empire he had built on her lies to save the legacy she had died to protect. The stillness of the hospital room was shattered by the sharp vibration of Do-Hyuk's own phone, a jagged contrast to the silence left in the wake of Lydia's confession. It was a call from his head of security. The board of directors hadn't waited for the dying queen to stop breathing. They had moved for the throat the moment they realized the secret calls had been intercepted. A final, coordinated hostile takeover was underway, an attempt to strip Do-Hyuk of his title before he could ever reveal the contents of Nicole's file. Do-Hyuk looked at Nicole, his jaw set in that mask of permanent authority, but this time the steel in his eyes was backed by a lethal clarity. "They think I'm weak because I'm here," he whispered, the rumble of his voice sounding like a luxury car idling before a race. "They think they can bury my father again." Nicole adjusted her stethoscope, her dark eyes studying him with the same quiet knowing that had dismantled him nights before. "Then don't go as the boss of Seoul," she said, her voice possessing a crystalline clarity that sliced through the antiseptic air. "Go as Johnny's son. Go as the man who is ready to answer the truth." Leaving Lydia in the care of the only person he now trusted, Do-Hyuk descended from the VIP wing and into the charcoal gray armor of his waiting SUV. The drive to the headquarters was a blur of neon lights and cold rain, a city that looked less like a kingdom and more like a graveyard for his family's legacy. As he stepped into the elevator of the Concade-style tower, the biometric sensors hissed, recognizing the man they were about to help destroy. The boardroom was a fortress of chrome and black marble, but tonight, it felt like a lion's den. His directors sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces twisted in a mix of predatory anticipation and lingering fear. They were the heads of the families who had once called his father partner, but now they looked at Do-Hyuk like vultures circling a carcass. "You're late, Do-Hyuk," the senior director sneered, clutching a digital contract that would erase the Nom name from the company forever. "We heard your mother was unavailable. We thought we'd save you the trouble of the transition." Do-Hyuk didn't sit in his usual chair. He walked to the head of the table, his presence occupying the space so completely that the air seemed to move around him. He threw the manila folder onto the polished surface with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. "The transition is over," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal octave. "I'm not here to talk about stock prices. I'm here to talk about the blood you used to buy them 20 years ago." The mahogany table, once a symbol of his absolute dominion, now felt like a chopping block. The senior directors exchanged panicked glances as Do-Hyuk's silence stretched, suffocating the room just as the antiseptic air had back in the VIP wing. He didn't look like a CEO caught in a coup. He looked like a man who had finally scrubbed the grime off a 20-year-old secret. "You think a folder of old rumors can stop a legal takeover?" the senior director barked, though his hand trembled as he reached for the manila file. He flipped it open, and the blood drained from his face as he saw not rumors, but the encrypted ledger transfers David Williams had died to protect. Do-Hyuk leaned forward, his eyes burning with a terrifying blue intensity that mirrored the icy gaze of the most feared men in the underworld. "That isn't a folder of rumors," he rasped, his voice dropping to a lethal octave that made the directors shift in their seats. "It's a map. A map of every bribe, every offshore account, and every hit you ordered to turn my father into a ghost and Nicole's father into a criminal." The room erupted into a civil war of accusations. Men who had called each other partners for decades began to fracture in real time, their united front against the Nom legacy dissolving into a desperate scramble for survival. Do-Hyuk watched them with a quiet knowing he had learned from Nicole, the realization hitting him that power was a useless currency when the truth was finally shouting through the silence. "Nicole Williams didn't just give me a file," Do-Hyuk announced, his voice possessing a crystalline clarity that silenced the bickering dons. "She gave me a mirror. And what I see in front of me isn't a board of directors. It's a courtroom of thieves waiting for a sentence." He stood up, the chair screeching against the marble floor, a sound that echoed the finality of a closing door. He didn't need a dead man's switch or a military-grade rifle to win this war. He had the truth beneath the antiseptic. As he turned toward the door, leaving the vultures, to tear each other apart over the ruins of their greed. Do-Hyuk realized the steel in his soul was finally gone. He wasn't the boss of Seoul anymore. He was a son who had finally answered the call. The drive back to the hospital was a blur of rain and neon, the city lights reflecting off the hood of the SUV like the fractured pieces of the empire Do-Hyuk had just dismantled. He didn't check the stock market or the news alerts screaming about the boardroom massacre. His eyes were fixed on the digital clock on the dashboard as it ticked toward the finality of the night shift. He had broken the vultures, but as he sprinted through the sterile corridors of the VIP wing, he realized that power was a hollow victory if he didn't make it back to the one person who knew his real name. The hospital room was silent, the aggressive humming of the machines replaced by a soft rhythmic hiss that felt like a long, slow exhale. Nicole Williams stood by the window, her silhouette a pillar of calm in the dim amber light. She didn't ask about the boardroom or the folder. She simply looked at the way Do-Hyuk's charcoal suit was rumpled, the armor finally discarded. In her hand she held the same black phone that had started this saga, its screen glowing with a soft, steady light. "You're just in time," Nicole whispered, her voice possessing that unsettlingly composed knowing that no longer felt like a threat. She stepped aside, allowing Do-Hyuk to reach the bedside of the dying queen. Lydia's eyes were open, but they were no longer searching. They were fixed on the ceiling, her breathing shallow and spaced, each intake of air a fragile promise that time was almost up. Nicole leaned over and placed the phone against Lydia's ear, then handed the other end of the connection to Do-Hyuk. "Say what you need to say," Nicole said softly, her dark eyes studying him with a quiet mercy. "The silence is over." Do-Hyuk took the phone, his hand no longer trembling with the hesitation of a CO, but with the raw grief of a son. He leaned down, his forehead resting against his mother's silver hair. "Yama," he breathed into the receiver, his voice cracking beneath the weight of 20 years of neglected goodbyes. "The ledger is safe. The shadows are gone. I'm home." Through the line, he heard a faint, rasping sound. A final effort from a woman who had spent 2 decades waiting for this exact frequency. "Hi, son," she whispered, the words barely more than a ripple in the silence. The monitor gave a long, steady tone, a crystalline clarity that signaled the end of the war. Do-Hyuk stayed there, clutching the phone in his mother's hand as the dying queen finally found her peace. Nicole watched from the shadows, her expression unreadable, knowing that while the boss had saved his legacy, the nurse had saved his soul. The aftermath of the boardroom massacre felt less like a victory and more like a quiet collapse. Nam Do-Hyuk stood in his office, the charcoal suit, armor finally stripped away, as he watched the sunrise crawl over a city that no longer felt like his kingdom. The ledger he had recovered was now in the hands of the authorities, a move that ensured the ruin of every director who had betrayed his father, but it also placed a target on his own back. He had achieved redemption for the Nam name, yet the cost was the very empire he had sacrificed 20 years to build. "You don't look like a man who just won a war," Nicole Williams said, her voice a calm chime in the hollow space of the executive suite. She stood by the mahogany desk, her blue scrubs replaced by a simple coat, her dark eyes studying him with that unsettlingly composed knowing. She wasn't a nurse today. She was the woman who had watched him dismantle a lie and rebuild a truth. "I destroyed the foundation to save the house," Do-Hyuk replied, his voice dropping to a low rumble, the steel replaced by a weary clarity. "The company will be tied up in litigation for years. My rivals will tear at the remains. But my father is no longer a ghost and your father's name is clear." He looked at the final legal documents on the desk, the ruin of his corporate life signed and sealed. Nicole stepped closer, her presence as steady as it had been beside the dying queen. "Lydia didn't just want you to clear the past, Do-Hyuk. She left a final request." She handed him a small, sealed envelope, a letter his mother had written through Nicole's hand in the final nights. As he read the jagged script, Do-Hyuk felt a final, sharp intake of breath. His mother hadn't asked him to save the company. She had asked him to take the resources he had left and build something that didn't require shadows at the door. She had asked him to ensure that the Williams family was never a fall guy again. "Power could not bargain with death," Do-Hyuk whispered, looking at Nicole with a quiet knowing that mirrored her own. "But it can finally pay its debts." He realized then that the silence of the hospital room hadn't just saved his life, it had rewritten his destiny. He was a son who had finally found his voice, even if it meant speaking from the ruins of his former life. The morning air in Seoul was sharp and carried the scent of rain, a familiar dampness that no longer felt like grime but like a necessary cleansing. Do-Hyuk stood outside the hospital entrance, his hands buried in the pockets of a coat that was far less imposing than the charcoal wool of his former life. He wasn't waiting for a motorcade or a security detail. He was waiting for the woman who had seen through the most powerful man in the city to find the son who had been lost for 20 years. Nicole Williams emerged from the sliding glass doors, her blue scrubs replaced by the same simple coat she had worn during their midnight confrontation. She walked toward him with that unsettlingly composed stride, her dark eyes studying the skyline before settling on him with a quiet knowing. The silence between them wasn't heavy or accusing anymore. It was a shared mental context, a recognition of the war they had fought together in a single hospital room. "The Gilded Spoon isn't in Seoul," Do-Hyuk said, his voice a low rumble that lacked its former edge of steel. "But there's a small place 3 blocks from here. They serve coffee that's almost as bitter as the secrets we buried." Nicole managed a rare, faint smile, the kind of expression that didn't just touch her lips but her eyes. "Black? Booth 4? She asked, her voice possessing a crystalline clarity that reminded him of the first time she had held out her phone. "Booth 4, Do-Hyuk confirmed, offering her a hand not as a command but as a request. "I think I can manage that." As they walked away from the hospital wing where power had finally bowed to time, Do-Hyuk realized the silent signal hadn't just saved his mother's legacy. It had rewritten his destiny. He had walked into that ward as a titan and was walking out as a man capable of the loudest revolutions. The corporate empire was in ruins, but the foundation of his soul was finally clean. Beside him, the mysterious nurse who had never seen him before, yet knew exactly how his story would end, walked in step with him. She had been the keeper of the ledger, the voice for the dying queen, and the mirror for the boss. Now, as the city hummed around them, they were no longer a target and a stranger. They were the beginning of a new chapter. Do-Hyuk looked up at the sky, realizing that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth, and the most powerful signal you can send is letting go.